Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 443, a 2-episode special. First, historian Angus Konstam comes on to discuss his book, The Convoy, where one man decides to go hunting for the U-boats versus the other way around. And then back to the Eastern Front with The Clash of Titans. Mr. Konstam, the author of over 100 books, like Salerno 1943, The Battle of North Cape, and his biography on Blackbeard, comes on to discuss a moment during the war that will see the Battle of the Atlantic changed in favor of the Allies and bring hope to the British people. Mr. Konstam, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure.
So I want to say that, as you can imagine, and I'm sure you've gotten a lot of feedback, this story, this book that you've written, The Convoy, it just goes and goes and goes, and I just know it's going to be turned into a movie. When that happens, please call me, and I'll carry your bags, and I'll be your assistant, whatever. It would just be so much fun. But this was an incredible story with a lot of significance that I don't think I appreciated until I read your book. So how did you come across this particular convoy, this story?
Well, Ray, it started, but it had nothing to do with it originally because about a dozen years ago, I started interviewing Arctic convoy veterans, and because they were getting a bit long in the tooth, and
Right.
I wanted to get them while I still could. And they were both merchant navy, British ones, some Norwegians, in fact, as well, and mainly British, some American, Canadian. And what got me was one of them said that the Arctic convoys were a sort of walk in the park. And I said, "You're kidding me! It's freezing out there." And
Yes.
and he said, he was in this Gibraltar convoy, and he was more terrified then at one stage than at any other point. And I was, and that was HG-76, and I was, and there was a merchant naval guy who was actually torpedoed 4 times in the war, which, he's a bit of a Jonah, I think, on his merchant ships.
Right.
And I learned 2 things for him. One is, in the British Navy, in the British merchant service at the time, when you were torpedoed, that was your pay stopped. The moment you stepped off that ship into the lifeboat. And and he said he couldn't, it happened up in, it was taken into Murmansk or Archangel or somewhere, and he had to wait 3 months or something, and they're basically living on Red Cross parcels.
Wow.
Usually it worked better, but he was taking part in this convoy as well. So there were 2 guys who I spoke to who played a part in it, and it kind of sat on a back burner for a long while, and then I just a couple of catalysts. Then I read an article about it by a guy called Mal Wright, a guy Australian, a historian who I've got a lot of time for, and he mentioned it in a short magazine article, and that got the ball rolling. So there we go.
That's incredible. And you're right. I mean, to go back to something you just said, that convoy must have been quite something to have someone go, "Oh, an Arctic convoy? Yeah, that's a Tuesday for me. Thank God I'm not having to do the Gibraltar run again." I mean, that speaks volumes in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, to put in context, HG-76 came at a time, it was running from Gibraltar it left on 14th of December 1941. I'm sorry, I'm going to put my dates in the sort of British way. So
Sure.
Apologies for that.
Nope.
I put them in a kind of logical order. You guys do it for 4th of July, don't you? So it's the one exception.
One exception, yes.
Mainly because it predates messing around with dates, maybe. But anyway, for late December 1941, exactly a week after Pearl Harbor. So, and at this point, the British have been fighting kind of the Battle of the Atlantic on their own, and things have been really getting kind of hairy. And when you have convoys where it's not unknown to have 10 or 12 merchant ships sunk in that convoy, then you can see something about what this guy was speaking about, because they had little in the way of escorts, and the losses were just quite astronomically high. And by the time his Arctic convoys were going about, convoys were much better protected. And part of the reason was thanks to some of the breakthroughs that came with HG-76.
Wow, that's incredible. So, yeah, whether ships are full or they're empty and they're going back home, it doesn't matter. All of these ships are valuable because they're going to be obviously needed in the future, which brings us to one Johnny Walker. So he's going to be in charge of the escorts part of this convoy, and he's got some ideas that he's been working on for some time about how to reduce the number of lost ships. His idea is to be a lot more aggressive. Can you introduce us to Johnny Walker, please?
Yeah, sure. Captain Frederick Walker, and he was given the nickname Johnny after the Scotch, after the whiskey. So, which seems logical. But he was a rarity in the interwar years in the Royal Navy, because if you wanted to get ahead, you had to specialize in ideally gunnery. Something like that, gunnery or torpedoes, or something at the fighting end of the. You had to gunnery was best because that's battleships, cruisers, surface engagements, and that's where the flag officers were groomed from sort of gunnery and torpedo schools and things, and that kind of thing. And what Walker did was he specialized in anti-submarine warfare, which was almost frowned upon. It was kind of ignored. And sonar, or ASDIC as the British called it at the time, was sort of perfected at the tail end of the First World War. And the interwar years, there was a little bit of development in it. But people like Walker, he was one of the guys who kind of got to grips with it and figured out what could be done and helped develop improvements in it. And so by the time the war started, he was still being kind of ignored. He was an expert in anti-submarine warfare, but he got command jobs. He was sent out to the Far East to be essentially the skipper of what was essentially the admiral's yacht, and all these jobs which were not really where his real talents lay. Right. And that went right through to time of Dunkirk in 1940, where the evacuation of Dunkirk, where he was taking part in supporting Admiral Ramsay's evacuation, his Operation Dynamo. But where he really needed to be was in the Atlantic, fighting U-boats. And that's what happened. It took until it was the middle of 1941 before he actually got the command he needed, which was command of a group, of a anti-submarine group of sloops, which are like small modern frigates, I suppose, and corvettes, which are a little bigger than. Well, as you know, you've probably all seen The Cruel Sea, which is an excellent movie, but you know how tubby a corvette is. You know, it pots along at 16 knots or whatever, but they could be mass produced based on a whaler, a design of a whaler, interwar whaler, and they were really helping to fill the gap. So earlier in the war, in 1940, a lot of the destroyers were used for fleet purposes, smaller ones. The Americans really pitched in with those 50 Lend-Lease destroyers, one of which plays a major part in HG-76. But they're really short of escorts. But by 1941, by the middle of 1941, they're starting to come online. These new corvettes and other warships are starting to appear. So there's a little more escort going on and a little less just having to make do with the few ships you have. So Walker was right in there. And his emphasis was on teamwork and skill and teamwork, and really using a number of warships to hunt. And the Admiralty, the British Admiralty, their whole idea with convoys, it was that their aim was to get the convoy safely from point A to point B. Now, that wasn't good enough for Walker.
Right.
He said, look, passively escorting the convoy isn't enough. If you want to safeguard convoys and convoys in the future, the aim is to sink U-boats. So he developed a more aggressive kind of tactic, which meant physically hunting down U-boats while still performing his escort duties, which is something that didn't happen. So in HG-76, he finally that was the first convoy. He got a chance as convoy escort commander, as a chance to show exactly what he could do.
That's amazing. Yeah, because his more aggressive style is going to be needed. I think you say somewhere in the book when convoys first started, the number of escorts was minimal, but they're losing ships left and right. I mean, the island of Britain, Churchill himself is truly stressed and worried about just losing so many ships faster than they can build them. So he's going to get a chance to implement this, like you said, because of the increase in ships. And you mentioned the Battle of the Atlantic a couple of minutes ago. I mean, it really is bad for Britain. They're pretty much alone on this. The Americans aren't in this, they're not able to be in on this yet. This is a convoy that really does need to get through. They need these ships because there's going to be a lot more convoys that's going on. And this is where we get to the heart of the story, the day after day of battle as the convoy goes on, which we're going to touch on in a second. But until I read your book, I don't think I fully appreciated that convoy duty is chess. It's not checkers. It's not one short, sharp battle. Everything's decided. The loser goes home or they're all at the bottom of the ocean. I mean, it plays itself out. There's a rhythm to it. There's moves, counter moves, anticipating your opponent. But at the same time, like Johnny Walker will show, if you're hardworking and you're thorough about what you're trying to do, it will pay off. You just may not see it at the beginning of the convoy.
Well, that's exactly it. His emphasis was teamwork, and when he got these ships, he couldn't even have all of his group of warships, of 9 warships, in one place at one time before this convoy, or much before it. They were always being peeled off to escort other convoys, but what he was trying to do was work them up. The naval parliament's working up his training for war as effectively as he can, and that's exactly what he was doing. He was taking them up to a base in the west coast of Scotland, training there, and then before in the fall of 1941, the late fall, they were shipped down to Gibraltar as escorting a convoy in the way, of course. And once they were in Gibraltar, their aim was to escort. The first real job was to escort HG-76, but the teamwork thing actually paid off because a few weeks before, one of these little corvettes, Marigold, they were all flower-class corvettes, are all named after flowers, and marigolds are quite sensible, but you start getting names of ships with flowers where you have to look them up in the dictionary because some of them have just crazy names. Pensamon is one of them, and Samphire and things. It's really unusual flowers. But you have building so many of them, you start going through the whole. You're looking for rare flowers to name ships after. However, Marigold sinks a U-boat off Gibraltar or close to Gibraltar. And this is around the time that HMS Ark Royal, the British carrier, was sunk there. And this all plays in as part of this whole change of strategy by the Kriegsmarine, where they're starting, instead of Vice Admiral Dunitz in charge of the U-boats, is concentrating on the transatlantic convoys. Due to Hitler's orders, he has to divert them into attacks on ones coming in and out of Gibraltar. He also has to send U-boats into the Mediterranean, and this was one of them. One of them had sunk. They sank the British battleship Barham off the coast of North Africa, and then the carrier Ark Royal close to Gibraltar. So they were having an effect. But once they were in there, once they were in the Mediterranean, it was a kind of a one-way thing, and getting them back out due to the tides and also the defences around Gibraltar, it was a kind of tough proposition, and they didn't really do it once the war began in earnest.
Yes, I love that party book, and I didn't put that together for myself. One of the many things in your book that you helped me understand better. But yeah, once those subs go into the Mediterranean, because Hitler has promised Mussolini support, you've got to support your partner. But at the same time, those U-boats were being very effective in the Atlantic, and I imagine Donitz was not too happy with having some of his subs taken away and taken into the submarine. But you stress this in your book, Johnny Walker wasn't the only one who was thinking about the future, thinking about a better way to deal with convoys, to protect convoys. Donitz has also spent years thinking about how new sub attack plans, and he finally gets to implement his ideas as well.
Yeah, 1941 is kind of big time for Dönitz. He, first of all, in 1940, of course, there's the fall of France, and rather than the very small number of U-boats starting the war, having to leave places like Kiel and Wilhelmshaven to get out into the Atlantic, past where I live here in Orkney, to get out there, he now has to go. He now has bases like Lorient, Saint-Nazaire and Bordeaux right on the Atlantic itself, on the coast of the Bay of Biscay. So there's no need for that big trip around the north of Britain. They can just head straight out to sea. Better still, they have airfields there, and if you really like French wine, thousands of people go to a place called Bordeaux, which does a kind of nice wine. I'm very fond of it myself. But there's the airfield there, Bordeaux-Marignac, used to be a World War II air base for the Luftwaffe. Right. And it was there that they based their Focke-Wulf 200 Condor 4-engine maritime reconnaissance aircraft. They were bombers, really, but they made perfect maritime reconnaissance airplanes because they could range out about 1,500 miles into the Atlantic. And once they found a convoy, they could shadow it for a dozen hours before they were relieved. So basically, they're a real pain. And one of the problems was you could drive these things off if you were within range of land-based aircraft. But for these convoys, that really meant within range of Britain, of the southwest corner of Britain, around Plymouth and Devon and Cornwall. Air bases then and then also Gibraltar, but in between there was nothing at all. So these things had free rein to shadow convoys, and once they did, they would vector in U-boats. They would radio base. They would contact Dönitz's headquarters outside Lorient in a nice seaside villa, and they would direct the U-boats there. So this whole thing by Hitler came at a bad time for Dönitz because he was winning the tonnage war, which was basically sinking more British merchant ships than the British could build, British and the Canadians. It was only two things happened, of course. The America entering the war on 7th of December meant that suddenly you had this phenomenal shipbuilding capacity, which totally changed that whole dynamic. But at the time, it was looking pretty bad for Britain because they were losing ships at a rate. You mentioned earlier, you can sink empty ones or ones just in ballast because that was still 4,000, 5,000 tons of merchant ship that couldn't carry a cargo anymore.
Right, exactly.
So they were almost as good as a fully laden ship. And the British were losing this badly. And the number of escorts gradually increasing started to make a difference. So things like Johnny Walker getting a chance to do this was one of the two key elements that made HG-76 such a key convoy and such a kind of success too for the Allies.
Hey everyone, Ray here. So the holidays are coming up. For some of us, it's a time to take it easy. For others, they will be on the go. Family time, shopping, travel. If you're the former, let Factor make it easy for you. If you're the latter, let their nutritious, convenient meals keep you energized for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal delivery service, is dietitian approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered right to your door. And Factor allows you to skip the trips to the grocery store, followed up by hours in the kitchen when all is said and done. Factor has over 35 weekly flavor-packed meals to choose from, and they can be ready in 2 minutes. You want to keep it simple? Factor's got you. You want Gourmet Plus options? Factor's got you. The same with their breakfast and lunch meals. And they have Protein Plus meals with 30 grams of protein or more per serving. Does apple cinnamon pancakes sound good? Or bacon and cheddar egg bites? This November, let Factor handle things for you. Head to factormeals.com/WorldWar250 and use code WorldWar250 to get 50% off. That's code WorldWar250 at factormeals.com/WorldWar250 to get 50% off. Right, which is what makes this story in this book so amazing. You've got Johnny Walker. He's been working on this. He's been practicing a little bit. He wished he could have practiced more, obviously, but he's about to test himself. Donitz has got his Wolfpack ideas. He's got the coast of France. He's got the reconnaissance plane. So he's got what he wants to a degree, and they're both going to go at each other, indirectly through their ideas, and that's what makes this so. This is why it's perfect for a movie. Not that you need me to tell you that. So these two giants are about to butt heads. Could you please, and you've already touched on it a couple times, but if you could just maybe give us an idea of HG-76, it's about to leave Gibraltar. How many ships in the convoy are we talking about, and how many escorts? What is Walker working with?
Right. HG-76, Homeward Gibraltar, it stands for.
Right.
They're OG and HG, and all convoys have these initials. Sierra Leone ones, transatlantic ones, all have different ones, different numbers. But it was just one of hundreds of convoys in crossing the Atlantic during the war. She wasn't particularly special in terms of what she was doing. There was nothing hugely vital except that she had 32 merchant ships of various sizes. But what their arrival in Britain would make a big difference, because at the time Britain was really struggling. This is what these ships carried in their holds was really what was needed to keep Britain in the war. Right. And they ranged from things like iron, just basic stuff like iron ore to iron parites, all kinds of stuff like this, but also foodstuffs, and that was kind of crucial. Britain couldn't produce enough food herself to feed her population in wartime. She needed to import things like wheat from Canada, from the United States, or the HG-76 included ships that had come up around up the coast from Africa, from the Indian Ocean, wherever else. They gathered in Gibraltar for this last run, right. But they include Spanish onions, which filled her hold with Spanish onions from Huelva, just up by Seville there. And that was something of a luxury in a way in wartime Britain, a rationed item. But a ship full of onions would be kind of big news when it arrived in Liverpool, if it arrived safely. Yeah. So the convoy itself, 32 merchant ships of various sizes with mixed bag of goods on board. Most of them were British, but some were, there was some Norwegian, some Swedish, various other nations were represented in it. Not quite as multinational as later convoys, like we mentioned the Arctic convoys, where there was a major American effort in a shipping effort there. But so this was a slightly different composition, but all just as vital, all the goods in it. As for the escorts, Walker had his own escort group of 9 ships, 2 sloops and 7 of these little corvettes. But Gibraltar was able to provide other ships too, so he could pretty much double the size of the escort. And some of the ships were added to it from other convoys and were lent for just a few days, and are sent out from Gibraltar. So efforts were made to protect this convoy, and the reason was they knew from intelligence. Everyone knows about the Enigma codes being broken and the ultra intelligence, where the British Admiralty knew that the Germans were going to target this convoy, and that a wolf pack was being formed by Dönitz called Wolfpack Sea Robber or Sea Rauber, which is essentially pirate. So Wolfpack Pirate is a great name.
There's the movie title.
It is right there. But it has got about initially a dozen U-boats are forming, and they're ordered to rendezvous off Cape St. Vincent. That's the bottom left of Portugal. So easy reach of Gibraltar. And in Gibraltar itself, Gibraltar Bay, imagine it filled with shipping, with these merchant ships. There are other convoys assembling at the same time. And right across the bay is the Spanish port of Algeciras. And of course, Spain, Franco had just won the Spanish Civil War. They were kind of on the German side. So the Abwehr, the German intelligence agency, had coast watchers essentially in Algeciras. So they were there in binoculars watching the harbour, and they would know when a convoy was sailing and when the ships were getting steam up. And that could be radioed to the German embassy in Madrid, and then within an hour that was passed on to Berlin, and then eventually on to Dönitz himself. So the Germans were that great source of intelligence. Once the convoy was at sea, they could use radio direction finding to pinpoint convoy movements through signals, through radio signals. And then, of course, they also had these search aircraft. So the Germans were quite, they kind of knew when the convoy was going to sail and what it composed. What they didn't realize were two things. One was that Walker was in charge, and he was ready to try his new tactics. The other big plus they had was Audacity. Now, HMS Audacity was an escort carrier. The British at the time called them auxiliary carriers. They hadn't figured out that actually it was the Americans who came up with escort carrier, which is a much more sensible name. And they had their own one, the USS Long Beach, which was doing operational trials at the time, I believe. And but Audacity was a one-off. She was a prototype for the British. She was a German cargo liner, which was essentially she was captured in 1940 in the Caribbean, and they took her to the northeast of Britain to a shipyard, and as the squadron leader of the Fleet Air Arm, the British Navy's fighter squadron that was embarked on her, said, as he was telling his pilots, essentially they just cut her down to the deck level and clapped on a flight deck onto the top of it. And that's essentially what it was. It was the ugliest, most impractical aircraft carrier. No island, no lift, no hangar, just a flat flight deck and a few arrestor wires, and that was it. But she was a prototype, and her job, remember I said there was that gap with these condors. They could shadow a convoy, and there's no way the convoy could deal with it. Well, when Audacity was finished and commissioned, she sailed with the convoy from Liverpool down to Gibraltar, and in that convoy escort, she managed to shoot down one of her planes. Managed to shoot down one of the condors that was shadowing it. So she kind of proved her worth. But the other thing she did, and this is became key for HG-76, was her pilots would go up in their Martlet fighters, a Wildcat, essentially, a US Navy Wildcat. The British gave them their own name, Martlet. And the pilots loved them because they had these really rubbish British planes until then, like biplanes, not biplanes like the Swordfish, because that wasn't a fighter, but they had equally pretty poor designed interwar years fighters. All the budget went to the RAF, and they could get glamorous fighters like the Spitfire, but the Fleet Arm always got the short end of the stick when it came to aircraft design. So they loved the Martlet. But when they'd take off on a dawn sweep, and the idea was you would search around a convoy. And this happened, they perfected this on the way down to Gibraltar. And so for HG-76, they had it nailed. And the trouble, it's all about the design of a U-boat. And we think of U-boats being these all-powerful warships, and Type 7C U-boats or Type 9 ones, which made up most of the wolf pack, were not that fancy, because they could do 17 knots or so on the surface, which was fast enough to get ahead of a convoy and wait in a sort of ambush position for it, and then they would submerge. As soon as they submerged, they could only do about 7 knots, which is actually just a fraction slower than the convoy itself. So that's not kind of useful. So they have to operate in the surface. So suddenly you've got these martlets that would then be the eyes in the sky that would go around the convoy, find a U-boat on the surface, and if any other guy was in charge of the escort group, he would just say, "Yep, there's a wolf pack out there, and we found a U-boat." But with Walker, that was different. They were finding U-boats 30 miles away from the convoy, and he would send out 4 escorts to go and attack it, to hunt it and attack it, guided in by the aircraft. So this was a whole new ballgame. So the escort carrier was a big advantage. It could chase the shadowing aircraft, the Condors, and it could also detect U-boats on the surface.
Right. So
big plus.
Absolutely. And so when I said a couple of minutes ago that escorting a convoy was like playing chess, now that you've added the little carrier, it's like 2D chess or 3D chess. I mean, it just gets more complicated, but at the same time, Walker's got more options in his hands, got more cards to play. So the convoy is about to take off. The British know, the Germans know that this is about to take off. So everybody knows, roughly what's going on. And even though I want to, and I want to leave so much of this for the readers, I don't want to ruin it for them, because it really was like a roller coaster movie ride. But as they head out, so maybe what we'll do is we'll kind of hit some highlights. But as they go out, there's a line of submarines, waiting for them, because they know they're about to go out. And Donitz, and see, this is what confuses me. Donitz seems to almost become obsessed as this convoy goes on, as this battle goes on. And do you get a sense that he maybe loses perspective, or he takes his eye from the ball? Because you can destroy a convoy or wound it, but it shouldn't cost you too many submarines.
That's right. And the up to then, convoys, like I said, some of them were losing 10 or 12 ships. And there was one of the Gibraltar convoys lost a dozen ships just a couple of months before. So there was a track record of these things going very badly wrong for the British. But the convoy goes out, and 32 merchant ships, as you know, convoys, you've seen the Greyhound, and it's great visual of the sort of convoys at sea. It's a big rectangle of merchant ships, and that's a very effective movie for this. And you see, so each one is 1,000 yards apart from the next one. They're in 9 columns of four rows, 9 columns ships in 4 rows. The last row is just made up is like half a row.
Right.
And each row is 400 yards apart. If you're a naval type, that'll be 2 cables. The Navy have wonderful. Let's do things in cables just to confuse them. So you got this box of ships, and it's about 4 miles across. That's a lot of ocean.
Yes.
And around that, you've got this ring of escorts, of these little corvettes and sloops and the odd destroyer escort and various other things. And Walker actually has enough for 2 rings. So he's got a kind of double protection. But what he does, when the convoy goes out, it forms up. It leaves at about just before 4 o'clock on Sunday, the 14th of December, heads out to Gibraltar, forms up in the Strait of Gibraltar, and starts heading out west into the Atlantic. And it's there is a marvelous bit where the Commodore, you see, each Commodore has commodore, and each convoy has a commodore in charge of it.
Right.
And in this case, this was no exception. It's a retired vice admiral, a British admiral. He was in the First World War, and so he's brought back from retirement, and he's spending his days fishing and having a good time and playing whist or whatever. And then suddenly the war starts again. So he's called back to the colours, and instead of a nice warship, he's put onto a merchant ship as the convoy commodore. Him and a group of about 6 guys with signallers with their flags and whatever, and that's it. You're saying, right, you're running this convoy. So, wow. But he does a great job, and what he does is he knows there's a wolf pack out there, so he jinks left. He turns down and follows the contours, follows the coast of Morocco, and he kind of sidesteps the U-boats. So for the first couple of days, everything's fine until the Germans suddenly realize that something's wrong, and they start sending their U-boats out to meet them. There on the morning of the 17th of December, that's when things really kick off, because the Condor sights the convoy, and then at the same time, one of the martlets on its dawn sweep sights a U-boat. And one of the first of the ones, and of course you get one U-boat, then you get all the others coming, because it'll be radioing to its buddies, and they'll all be assembling. And like I said, they attack at night under cover of darkness. At dawn, they tend to go away from the convoy. They could see the smoke from over the horizon, a dozen miles away or thereabouts. 12, 15 miles, depending on visibility, from the conning tower of the U-boat, but they're fairly safe. But suddenly these martlets are up there, and they're spotting them. And that's exactly what happened to U-131. And it was kind of unfortunate for it, especially because Walker was in charge, and he sent four of his ships to go and attack it. And they hunt it and hunt it and hunt it until they get it.
Yeah.
Walker did.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Ray. Go on.
No. I apologize. You go right ahead. Let me just do this real quick. I'm sorry.
I'll just.
Let me
I'll
just say this.
Drone on. You get a word in, Ray.
That's right. Let me say this, and then you can either respond or keep going. Yeah, so the one thing that it really helped me understand in your book was Walker, and you touched on this a moment ago, was Walker was like, they're submarines, let's force them down, they're limited in their speed and they're limited in other options, let's keep them down there, that's where they're weakest, and that's where we'll get them at. So he's got a plan to drive them under, and the planes certainly do help with that, but like you said, at night, that's when the U-boats come back, and that's the scary time for all the convoys, because that's normally when the U-boats creep in close and do their thing.
Yeah. So what happened that morning on the 17th, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday? Was it? Yeah, Tuesday the 17th. This U-boat U-131, Corvette Capitan Arent Bauman's in charge of it, and he's spotted, and suddenly you get these 4 escorts directed towards them by the circling aircraft. Now, what they used to do, imagine this: sonar, or ASDIC, as the British weirdly call it, works like an ice cream cone shaped sound beam, right? So when the ship passes over it, when you're directly over that U-boat, you'll lose contact for a vital 30 seconds or so, until you start dropping those depth charges. Any really smart U-boat skipper will suddenly increase speed and just head away and try to avoid that.
Right.
What Walker did by hunting in groups was he would have one ship whose sole job was to detect that U-boat on sonar and then shadow it and then keep that contact. And it would use its radio to direct the other ships over the U-boat and then depth charge it. And so it was all about teamwork and communication, which is something that, the Navy, all navies have taken on board since. But it seems sensible. But in those days, it wasn't necessarily practiced. They didn't have the escorts to do it. But now, for the first time, they were really using them far more effectively. And Walker's thing was, you don't just drop the depth charges, you keep dropping depth charges until you make sure you've got that thing. And that's exactly what happened to poor Baumann and his crew. So that was the first U-boat. Actually, there is the second U-boat from the Wolfpack. One was sunk off Cape St. Vincent. It was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right.
When, remember, I said it was assembling off there. A British and Australian group of warships came and detected this U-boat in the U-boat. It was just leaving the U-boat assembly area off Cape St. Vincent for the Wolfpack. And U-127 was sunk by these Allied destroyers. But U-131 was the first blood for Walker and his tactics and his convoy. And it happened the next day. And it's the same thing, because they're detected by one of the martlets, or the wildcats, if you prefer. Same thing, morning, the thing, they spotted it during a morning sweep, and then it's by 10 in the morning, that U-boat 434 is sunk. So 2 U-boats sunk in 2 days is unheard of in these operations, all for the loss of no ships to the convoy. So this is all going well, but at the same time, the Admiralty in London is radioing to Walker and saying, look, we've got reports that you mentioned Dunit's going a bit crazy. And in a way, he was doing that. He was doubling down. Instead of saying, look, this is getting a bit hairy, there are other convoys out there, we'll take these away and we'll attack another convoy. He doubled down. He was sending reinforcements, both from the Atlantic, diverting ships which were already on their way out. And remember, this is a week after Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
So, and it's the start of what was known as the second happy period. Well, it's not happy for the merchant ships, but it's happy for the U-boat crews.
Right.
Cruising off the American eastern seaboard, and it was just happy hunting for them.
Yes.
But these were ships which were on their way out there, to sink ships off the Carolinas or Newfoundland or anywhere down the coast. And they were now diverted down to this running battle, which was taking place as the convoy was heading north, parallel to the coast of Portugal, about a couple of hundred miles out to sea. So Dönitz is reinforcing this already quite tough convoy battle. So the British now have got these signals saying, there's more coming. And they go from, there's 4 U-boats, there's 6 U-boats. In the end, there were 11 U-boats attached even temporarily to Wolfpack Sea Rauber. But normally you're dealing with 6 of them at any one time. But Walker is told that these are assembling and they're going to get you and they're going to hunt for you that night. So he knows that a big kind of the first of the big challenges is coming up ahead.
Right. And can I just say, when I was reading this book, when you got to the part where you describe the maneuvers, when he would send out like 4 ships to hunt us up, I really love, it was coordinated, it was thought out, it was obviously effective. So Dönitz loses 1 sub, he loses 2 sub, and he's starting to lose perspective, like you said. He keeps sending more and more subs. Now, it's important for the listeners to remember that as far as anybody is concerned, on both sides, maybe with the exception of Walker himself, everybody's expecting the convoy to lose a certain number of ships because, as you said earlier, that's just what happens. They just can't keep up with them. But quickly, this is starting to turn into something that's bad for the U-boats. But then along comes what happens to HMS Stanley. Could you describe that for us, please?
Yeah, just touching on your point about convoys. Yeah, they reckoned that 10%, 15% losses was acceptable.
Wow.
So that in the size of this convoy, that's 3 to 5 ships. That was seen as standard losses for the time.
Just written
Anymore,
off.
it was a bad Anymore, it was a bad convoy that could have 3 or 4 times that in some really shockingly bad cases.
Yeah.
So, and with this number of U-boats concentrating, that was going to be particularly a real challenge. Yeah, Stanley. Well, Stanley was a Lend-Lease destroyer. Thank you, America.
Right.
Well, really useful at a critical time. Remember, I said that Britain had almost no escorts available. Their fleet destroyers were needed with the fleet. Britain was fighting in the Mediterranean. It was fighting in the Kriegsmarine in the North Atlantic, and it needed every destroyer it could. So other escorts were few and far between, but these 50-year-old destroyers were really useful. And one of them was Stanley. I can't remember what American was it. McCalla, USS McCalla.
That sounds right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, she was obsolete. She was a bit of a rust bucket, but she was a useful unit in that she had a. I hate that phrase "unit." It's a modern thing, isn't it? She was a ship.
Right.
And Stanley was a Clemson class or something destroyer who was essentially just given a coat of paint and a British crew, fitted with British ASDIC or sonar,
Right.
and sent back out to war. And she was torpedoed early in the morning of the 19th of. On the 19th December, and it was 4:15, and she was behind the convoy. Remember, it's like that big box 4 miles across, and she was at the middle of the back of this box, a mile or so behind it. And her skipper, David Shaw, just. He got no warning of it. His crew got no warning of it. Suddenly, they were just hit by torpedoes fired by this U-boat, U-574. Hits the port side, and she just starts going down. A mile away, off her starboard beam, is Walker on the bridge, and bridges is open bridges in these ships. It's none of these nice, cozy bridges. The British had the idea, which I'm not sure a lot of sailors would have agreed with the Admiralty in this, that if you're in an open bridge, you can see things coming. Like a Stukas are attacking, you're off Crete, and they suddenly go, oh, they're up there. You can see them, and you can react to them. And there were also, I imagine, armchair admirals liked the idea that they'd be alert and whatever, and you'd get complacent in your nice enclosed bridge.
Right.
But my time in the Navy was all in nice enclosed bridges. Thanks very much, and I'm very grateful to the ship designers for that one. But so he was having his cup of cocoa, I think, was being brought to him, or a tea or a cocoa or something.
Right.
On the bridge of HMS Stork, his sloop, and he was about a mile away from Stanley, and she suddenly just erupted. Stanley had reported sighting a U-boat or having a contact with a U-boat, and then she exploded. So what Walker did is he, as well as being aggressive, he'd also developed his own tactics. And one of them was called Operation Buttercup. That was it's very unmilitary, but that's Walker's way. He didn't take things. He was a very serious guy, very religious, very centurion figure, but he had a degree of flippancy about him too, which was quite nice. And his nickname for his wife was Buttercup.
Oh,
and
that's cute.
Well, that's sweet. Yeah, but in this context, it was a little different. So Operation Buttercup, he had essentially. You keep on bursting into every time I say Buttercup. It's great. This is what Buttercup is. Yeah, Buttercup. Okay. It's all these operations of all these marvelous names, but very martial names. But this doesn't. Right. Anyway, the operation which can't be named is essentially he had. If the convoy was attacked, he'd respond, and he trained his command to, if he called out Buttercup's astern or port or starboard, that was the threat was coming from that side, and this was Buttercup astern because this ship was hit behind. So what happens when he gives the order Buttercup astern? after laughing at the name, which is understandable, it's kind of like you're speaking like chess. You mentioned chess, and it's kind of like this. This is more like a choreographed dance.
Yes,
Because the two
exactly.
escorts on the outer sides suddenly turn, if it's Buttercup's turn, they turn around and steam south, steam astern behind the
Right.
convoy at top speed. So they're kind of on either flank of the convoy. And they start firing off star shells into the intervening space. So the whole area is lit up by star shells. Stork, meantime, is back there, and she does something else. Her job is to go around and fire off randomly drop depth charges just to keep any German on their toes.
Right.
And they think to build up pressure. She's also firing off. Everyone's firing off star shells. The convoy is firing off star shells. That comes a big mistake later, giving these merchant guys flares, But and it's like a 4th of July sort of farmer party. But
Right.
in this case, you've got the thing bathed in, and the aim is to force the U-boat underwater. If he's on the surface, in all that light, he'll be seen. So that's what U-574 and its skipper Gengelbach does. He dives. And when he dives, he's detected on Aztec by Walker and Stork. And so instead of just randomly depth charging, and he keeps depth charging, he keeps a mile away from the wreckage of Stanley, so he doesn't hurt the men in the water. Again, that's the cruel sea for you, isn't it?
Yes.
But he detects the U-boat and starts depth charge attacks. And he starts plastering it, and eventually he damages U-574 and brings it to the surface. And then, as you say, we won't spoil the story in the book, but what happens is kind of a ludicrous situation where the U-boat's turning circle is sharper than Walker's sloop. So the two kind of circle around each other, shooting at each other until Walker gets the good angle, and he kind of manages to ram it.
Right.
And then beat Walker, he didn't just ram it, he rammed it and then depth charged it as he was going over it. So he kind of made sure that 574 wasn't going anywhere. So all this was just part of Walker's attack plan, his aggressive tactic of just hunt. If they're going to attack somebody in the convoy, in this case it was Stanley, but it could have been a merchant ship, you respond immediately by hunting it until it's sunk. And that's exactly what happened there. Yeah. Although, like I said, there were several U-boats in the area, and that night, just about an hour later,
right,
the convoy suffers its first loss, the SS Rukinga, which goes up and is torpedoed by U-108, another lurking U-boat. So it's all going down, but in this convoy battle, the Germans kind of back off for the night because it's obviously they're alarmed by all this pyrotechnics going on, but also losing one of their own U-boats is a bit of a body blow. So that's 3 U-boats now for the loss of 1 merchant ship and 1 escort.
That's incredible, and you do such a great job in the book of balancing out. There's attacks, there's counterattacks, there's Walker's moves, there's ideas, and it's almost like Walker's ideas are pitted against Donitz's numbers, because, like you said, he just keeps throwing subs at this thing, but all the while, the convoy is getting ever closer. It's getting ever closer to home, and most importantly, it's getting ever closer to being protected by the land-based planes in southern UK. And so that's still going on. But then again, the one huge advantage the convoy had, the wild card that they may not have counted on, was the escort carrier. But then the carrier's commander doesn't take Walker's advice. I guess technically he doesn't have to, but he ends up paying the price for not sticking to Walker's plans. Could you describe that for us?
Yeah. Commander McKendrick was a pilot by training. He was a First World War pilot. He landed up being in the RAF, then the Fleet Air Arm, and he did his ship command course and became the skipper of this of Audacity. He was the perfect guy for it.
Right.
But he, after a few nights of these attacks, he decided that look, they'd intercepted signals from the Germans saying that look, this carrier is basically a pain in the ass. We've got to get that. It's causing a lot of trouble. So he decided he was going to be his carrier. The Audacity was the prime target, more than even the merchant ships. So. He thought by sitting in his position, his slot at the back of the convoy, was actually dangerous for the merchant ships around him. So he got into the habit of, at night, pulling out of the convoy and operating on his own, sometimes with an escort. But on the night of the 21st, Walker couldn't afford an escort because they were actually attacked by, they knew that they were going to be attacked that night, again, due to intercepted signals, by at least 6, maybe more U-boats. So he needed every ship. And what Walker did was come up with a plan of holding a mock battle. This is one of his ideas that didn't work well. And the reason was a lack of briefing to the convoy. Because a mock battle is great. These ships go off and start firing off depth charges and star shells, and the convoy quietly turns and goes in an opposite direction. And again, it's that idea of kind of sidestep the U-boats. And it would have worked if the convoy itself hadn't suddenly got panicked by all this and started firing off star shells themselves. So every U-boat in 10 miles could see them and knew exactly where to go. So all this was going off, but at the same time, another U-boat, U-751, spotted what it thought was the skipper thought was probably a lone tanker or something, a straggler. So he torpedoed it, hit it, and it was only then that he figured out this was the carrier. This was Audacity. Wow! Because McKendrick was operating on his own about 10 miles away from the convoy. And it was pitch dark night. You could barely see, the end of your flight deck on the carrier, apparently. And but he could see this. But this U-boat spotted him and hit him. And so Audacity is dead in the water. She's lost power. She's just sitting there. And what the skipper of U-751 does is he gets all his torpedoes. He's fired off his torpedoes. He has to reload them, and that takes time. And these U-boats the space in them is limited. You need to like diesel subs. The nuclear boats are a bit different, but all diesel subs, you need every inch of space.
Right.
They have to move bags of onions and bags of crates of cans of Spam or whatever out of the way to get at the torpedoes, to reload these things, because you've got to move them through the ship and into the. So that all takes time. So it's sitting there reloading. Walker just orders his mock battle group, these 4 escorts. They're having this mock battle, and they said, "Look, go and 2 of you come back to me. 2 of you go and escort Audacity," and that's what he does, because at the same time, at that same moment, the convoy is under direct attack. It's got no fewer than 4 U-boats circling around it, all trying to break through his formation. And that's when the convoy takes its second loss, when a Norwegian ship, the Anavor, erupts near the back of the convoy, and it goes down in a minute. They're out of, I can't remember the number of crew, I think 40 odd, there's something like 4 survivors. So, and she sank almost instantaneously in a minute. Walker does his, he thinks it's coming from starboard. If he'd taken a couple of moments to think it through, he would have figured out it was astern.
Yeah.
So he's actually does his, all the star shells and things and that whole routine in the wrong direction. And the U-boat who did the deed, U-567, skippered by Engelbert Endras, U-boat ace, he manages to get away. But At the same time, there are three other U-boats circling around the convoys trying to break in, and they're all spotted at different stages by different escorts. So they're all fighting pretty hard to chase these U-boats and depth charge them, and there's all these convoy battles are erupting all around. So it's a pretty fraught time, and this is the climax of the whole thing. Right. But Endras is interesting because he's a U-boat ace. I live in Orkney, and overlook my study here, overlooks Scapa Flow, and I can see the buoy where the battleship Royal Oak was sunk by Gunther Preen on U-47 in 14th of December 1939. And Endras was his second in command. He was his XO, and what happened is by 1941, he was something of a U-boat ace, but he was also a kind of jaded one. Right. A lot of the top U-boat aces had been lost by then. He should really have been retired to a staff job and commanding a flotilla from the comfort of an armchair in Lorient or somewhere. But they kept him at sea, and. So he was taking part in these attacks, but he got that second ship. But he was just one of the number of reinforcements sent, and doing it sent Endras along with a signal Endras is coming, like it was to encourage the morale of his already depleted wolf pack to kind of keep fighting.
Right. So again, this is the part, like you said, this is the climax. But by now, as someone who sat here and read, a lot of the book all in one go, the tension by this time is incredible. There's moves, there's counter moves. Both sides have drawn blood. But again, you're still waiting, because I didn't know the end of this story. So I'm still waiting for something amazing to happen for the Germans. And then suddenly tons of convoy ships are lost, because like you said, that's kind of what's been happening. So it's tit for tat, but again, the convoy never stops moving. They're getting closer. Walker gets to try his ideas. And you stress in the book, there were some of the escorts that were never meant to go the entire journey. So they're turning around. They're heading back to Gibraltar. So he's losing escorts left and right. The story just builds and builds and builds. And that's where we're going to leave it for the listeners, because I really want them to experience what I experienced. But I will warn the listeners, you have a knack for making the last sentence of every chapter make me turn the page and keep reading. I kept going, okay, I'm going to stop here. And then you would, this cute little sentence, and the master of cliffhangers. That's all I can say. But anyway, this book.
Well, thank you. I mean, I've got to say, I like writing narrative history, and I like reading it. And I blame Bruce Catton for it. Who wrote those American Civil War books, like Grant Goes South or Moves South or whatever, and all those. Right. And he could take a lot of information and synthesize it down into something that was really readable and made sense and was great, and made you want to read to the next chapter. And I was a kid when I read those, and I thought, that's the way that's great, And you read a lot of history books, and they kind of take a really interesting thing and turn it into something turgid. And I've always wanted to take the Bruce Catton style of doing these things, rather than something duller, something less readable. So it's if you can't make it exciting to yourself, that's no good. You've got to make it exciting for yourself and for the readers.
Exactly. Well, mission accomplished, because I lost a lot of sleep. So thank you a lot for that. So just get
for that.
No, just give us an idea. So what were some of the final tallies, if you have that off the top of your head, like how many of the convoy ships made it? How many U-boats were lost? Because again, this is something that did not happen before. This is something new in the Battle of the Atlantic.
Yeah, well, just to spoil the ending slightly, the bulk of the convoy reached Liverpool on the 29th of December, and with 30 ships. Those two were lost, but the rest made it. So that was well below the average. But until now, it was rare for a U-boat to be sunk in the convoy operation. And suddenly to have this number, 4 or 5 or 6 U-boats sunk or damaged or literally just, well, you got to the stage that by Christmas Day, when the convoy was reinforced by warships from Western Approaches Command, and was within air cover of Britain, suddenly doing its calls off the attack. So he actually, he may have been obsessed with it, but at least he knew when finally to cut his losses, and so he knew when to fold them.
Yes, but eventually. Like you said, I think at least 5 U-boats were lost, and others were damaged. So he's going to have to change up some tactics, at least in the short term, because they have to make good those losses. So this is the Battle of the Atlantic, slowly coming around, slowly changing. There's going to be more ships, the Americans involved, and I think some of Walker's attitude as far as being more aggressive starts to spread throughout some other escorts. So I think it's his idea to take the fight to the enemy and to not simply defend ourselves.
Yeah, that's it, Ray. Dönitz was fighting a tonnage war and winning it, and suddenly this was the first time that the tonnage war has been turned around. Now it was his U-boats who were losing the tonnage, and that was kind of a bit of a turning point. But when Walker got home, the two things happened. The Admiralty, the British Admiralty are like anything in the British military. It normally takes time for them to, at least a century for them to figure out, what to do and change their mind about things. Can you imagine the days when they had to stop wearing red, for instance, as a uniform?
Yes.
It must have taken, but they latched onto this quite quickly when the Admiralty probably a little better than the Army, I suppose, and they'd figured out that 2 things were a success. One was Walker and his aggressive tactics, and that became enshrined in the manuals for escort commanders in the future, not just in the British Navy, but the U.S. Navy, because the U.S. Navy was starting to enter the convoy, the Battle of the Atlantic themselves, and they were taking the lead in a way from the way the Royal Navy had dealt with it, because the Royal Navy had been fighting this since 1939 and had gained experience of it. But Walker's tactics were then taken on board. But the other big Anglo-American angle was the escort carrier, because Audacity was lost, but she was a prototype, and at the same, basically, the first American one was being built. More was at sea, was doing was operational. You had more being built, and more means vast numbers more. So that escort carrier was going to be a real convoy. A turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic was when those things appeared in numbers to make a real difference.
Right. And the happy time that the U-boats had is going to come to an end. Angus, thank you very much for this book. Thank you for your time. For everyone out there, it's the Convoy HG-76, Taking the Fight to Hitler's U-Boats. 1, you will enjoy the book. 2, you will learn a lot. 3, you're probably going to miss some sleep. But Mr. Konstam, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Well, you can avoid the sleep problem by listening to the audiobook, and then you can just switch it off when you want to do something. Keeps you awake when you're driving, too.
There we go. Point well taken, sir. I will get me the copy of that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ray. Great speaking to you.
Programming note. Hey everyone, Ray here. My health issues are playing tag with me, and they tagged back in. So I have the next episode written, but as you can probably tell from my voice, I'm not reading anything anytime soon. So I had 2 gentlemen, I use that term loosely, who've been on the show, and they're going to do this episode for me this week. Tony Lupo and Ryan Fairfield from the Warrior Next Door podcast. They've been on the show a couple of times. I think they're going to come on next month or later this month. Anyway, so they have generously agreed, because I contacted them at the last moment, to read this week's script. So we are going back to the Eastern Front and see what Army Group North is up to. I'll be back as soon as I can.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the History of World War II podcast. As you can tell, I'm not Ray Harris. Unfortunately, Ray is sick this week, and to further your despair, he's invited the hosts of the Warrior Next Door podcast to handle host duties for this episode. My name is Ryan Fairfield, one of the co-hosts of the Warrior Next Door podcast, here to introduce this episode and provide a little background on who exactly we are. And shortly, my counterpart, Tony Lupo, will lead the episode. You may have heard about us previously on the History of World War II as guests of Ray in episodes that aired in November of 2021 and 2022, where we discussed the vision of our podcast and even played some clips from veterans that we've featured. Tony and I have been interviewing veterans as volunteers for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project since 2003 and have amassed well over 200 interviews in our database. Our podcast centers on the experience of each veteran so that we can make new generations aware of their experiences, values, trials, and sacrifices. You can find us, the Warrior Next Door podcast, on all major podcast directories. Now, sit back and listen to my co-host, Tony Lupo, narrate episode 443.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 443, part B, The Clash of Titans. Last time, Field Marshal von Lieb's Army Group North had shattered its way through the Baltic states, now just inside Russia proper. Their next obstacle, and close to the last one before Leningrad, was the Luga Line, about 85 miles or 136 kilometers south of Leningrad. That's the town itself, in front of or to the west of the Luga River, that was the basis of the defensive line that ran from the Gulf of Finland to past Lake Ilmen in the south. As the defensive line was just over 100 miles or 160 kilometers long, the Germans might be forgiven for thinking they could just focus their panzers and smash through. But those days were gone. In fact, since late July, the Germans found that when they attacked and took an area or city, the Soviets were soon counterattacking in waves, causing the Germans to close ranks more often than continuing to send units forward. Now it seems more units had to be thrown together, and not just to win a local contest, but to hold said area afterward. Thus, Lieb decided that before the Luga area, again in front of the river, would be attacked again, he would wait for the majority of the 18th Army to move into position, coming from northern Estonia, and for the 16th Army to move up from eastern Latvia. This they did, and on August 8th the Germans advanced, and then they didn't, as they were unable to penetrate the Hydra-like Soviet lines. To be sure, the Soviets were killed or captured, but there always seemed to be more ready to take their place. Still, the attackers took advantage of the long defensive line closer to the coast or north. The Soviet 8th Army was slowing the advance of the 41st Panzer Corps. But then the 8th Panzer Division was attached to the 41st Panzer, which began to move once again. But it was the success of the German units further to the south that made the difference. Lieb's plan called for the just-mentioned 41st Panzer Corps to fight in the north, coming ever closer to Leningrad. Meanwhile, the 56th Panzer Corps would make for Luga proper. That is, the city located roughly in the middle of the Luga line. And once past all resistance, the Corps would swing northward. As would the 1st and 28th Infantry Corps. They were to reduce the Soviet 48th Army in front of them, located just above Lake Ilmen. And the 39th Panzer Corps, borrowed from Army Group Center, was on the way, but would not be in the area until August 24th. Sticking with this plan for a moment, after the line was breached at Novgorod, just above Lake Ilmen, was taken, the Germans would travel up to the Volkhov River that ran north to south. Turning the tables, the Volkhov would be used by the Germans as a defensive line while Leningrad was destroyed completely on Hitler's personal orders. Fortunately for the 41st Panzer Corps in the north, The more southern units had success, which forced the Soviet 8th Army, also in the north, to back up closer to the coast, thus avoiding being cut off by the German troops further to the south that could have swung in behind them. The Germans came at the Luga line on August 8th and 9th. This left the 16th Army to attack south of Lake Ilm a few days later, and it would be their success that threatened the entirety of the Luga line. The Germans came in hard, but were met with equal resistance. Still, now that the attackers were more focused, breaches started appearing in the defensive line. Soon, some 30,000 Soviet troops were cut off and surrounded. The remains of the Luga operational group had only 9 divisions, but each division now had a fraction of the men they did before this attack. Things looked bad for the defenders, but as this was still early in the war, Stalin remained convinced that he could simply keep throwing his men at the Germans until they stopped. So a counterattack was being planned, and the Soviet target was the area around Lake Ilmen, where the Germans had first broken through. The Soviet counterattack, called the Staraya Russia Offensive Operation, would have 2 large forces: the just created 48th Army, which would attack north of the lake, while the newly created 34th Army, but backed by the 11th and 27th Armies, would drive west just below Lake Ilmen. Their goal was to retake and hold Staraya Russia, and in order to do that, they would have to destroy the German 10th Infantry Corps of the 16th Army. The added benefit was the panzers without infantry for protection were vulnerable. This counterattack commenced on August 12th, and right away, the 10th Infantry below the lake was in serious trouble. Forget holding the line. They were about to be overwhelmed themselves. Wasting no time, the next day, August 13th, the 56th Panzer Corps, fighting closer to Luga proper, thus to the north of Lake Ilmen, were ordered to be pulled out of their current fight, head south, and save the 10th Infantry Corps. But there was only one problem with that. The Soviet forces in front of the 56th Panzer Corps, now down to 2 motorized divisions, were not allowing the Germans to pull away. The more they tried, the more the Soviets came in. There was nothing for it. The 10th Infantry was told to hold on while the 56th Panzer made their own mad dash at the enemy units in front of them. It took this push to drive the Soviets back enough for the 56th Panzer Corps to pull away and move out 5 days later. But this desperate move paid off as the Soviet 34th Army, giving the German 10th Infantry Corps hell, were caught unawares and in their flank. The results were predictable enough. The Soviet 34th Army was driven back and some 12,000 of its men were captured. Meanwhile, below Lake Ilmen, the Soviet 34th, 11th, and 27th Armies were also mauled by the 16th Army and 56th Panzer Corps. This allowed the Germans to come ever closer to Leningrad. The newly arrived 39th Panzer Corps from Army Group Center dashed to a place to the southeast of Leningrad. They were to help cut off the city while making sure no Soviet reinforcements came from the east. Still, the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, continued to create new armies and throw them into the fray. But the Germans, using the Volkhov River to the east of Leningrad, kept the Soviets back. By September 1st, the last rail link to Leningrad was cut. By September 8th, the last land route out of Leningrad was cut by the 39th Panzer Corps, assisted by the 28th Infantry Corps. Hitler's gamble of breaking off the 39th Panzer Corps had paid off. Leningrad would not be getting help from Moscow. Not that the Stavka didn't try. The Soviet 54th Army threw themselves at the 39th Panzer Corps again and again, trying to get men inside the city to help the 55th Army already there. But the result, only more Soviet casualties and prisoners. And then Hitler changed his mind. Autocrats, after all, are known for doing this. Why? Because they can, and no one can gainsay them. In early September, Hitler was ready to move on with his largest objective, the capture and destruction of Moscow. Now he ordered that Leningrad not be destroyed forthwith, but rather the people therein were to be starved to death, or at least until they surrendered. No, now Army Group North-Lieb was ordered to hand over all of his armored units, except the 39th Panzer, which had 1 Panzer and 2 motorized divisions, and turn them over to Army Group Center for the taking of Moscow. It was to be called Operation Typhoon. Thus, the 41st, 56th, and 57th Panzer Corps were ordered south, along with the headquarters of 4th Panzer Group, which is how Leningrad was spared, but only to suffer greatly for the years to come. And even then, the 39th Panzer Corps would soon get orders to push on east beyond the Volkhov River, which they would find daunting to say the least. Not that everything behind the German line was running smoothly. The capital of Estonia, Tallinn, had resisted, or rather, the Soviet troops within it had held back the Germans, who sent most of their troops on, as nothing could be allowed to delay the taking of Leningrad. As Estonia is the northernmost of the Baltic states, Tallinn, its capital and largest port city of the country, had access to the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea, making its control vital. Alas, the city of Tallinn, and of course the Estonia people, had been through hell already when the Soviets came in without asking, and now the Germans were here and they had not asked either. When Army Group North had first reached Tallinn in early August, its defense was carried out by some reserve units and a bit later by the 9th Army, but within it was the Soviet 10th Rifle Corps, comprised of 3 rifle divisions and several naval infantry brigades, so around 50,000 men. This holdout had to be reduced, if not simply because those German troops were now desperately needed at the front, as Hitler played his rather spontaneous game of chess. The Germans came at the first ring of defense around Tallinn on August 19th. It was bloody, it lacked mercy, and it never seemed to end. But after 4 days of constant fighting, the first line was breached. This allowed the attackers to get within 6 miles of the city, and the fighting continued. Within 48 hours, the fighting took place on the very streets of the capital. The Stavka could see the writing on the wall, but instead of losing tens of thousands of more men, it decided to evacuate those troops that remained and let the city fall, as it was clearly going to anyways. The evacuation got underway on August 27th. The city fell the next day. The good news for Moscow was that some 30,000 men were taken away, but not all of them reached safety. First, almost 12,000 Soviet fighters were left behind. Such was the haste of the evacuation. They were captured. Few would survive the war. More good news. The Baltic Red Banner Fleet still controlled the waterways around Tallinn. However, they did not control the air. Thus, the Luftwaffe did all they could to make sure those trips did not get away unmolested. Of the 2 massive convoys of 84 and 78 ships respectively, 5 destroyers and 41 troop ships were sunk. Only about half of the 30,000 rescued men made it away. As stated, elements of the Soviet Navy still controlled the waterways, but of course that did not suit Hitler's plans. Thus, Operation Beowulf was concocted. This would be the taking of the Baltic islands of Ossel and Dago, and also Huoma. Whoever controlled these islands controlled the Gulf of Riga and the entrance to the Gulf of Finland. The bad news for the Germans was that the islands were guarded by just over 23,000 Soviet troops, who were entrenched in heavy fortifications. Realizing this, the Germans tasked the job to the 61st Infantry Division, a few combat pioneer units, all carried by 100 ships, and they were protected by 180 small assault boats. The Soviet troops knew they were coming, but it didn't make a difference. First, the smaller islands were landed on September 8th. As the defenders could not support each other, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. On October 12th, Wima, the largest of the islands, was attacked, and the fighting was over by the 21st. And just like the Eastern Front in general, the Soviets suffered terribly. 19,000 men were captured. Just under 5,000 were killed during the fighting, while the Germans lost just under 3,000 men. But again, the Germans were being bled here and there, well, everywhere, and time would show this to be a losing proposition. As bad as this was for the Soviets, it was actually worse, as during all of this fighting, to the southwest of Leningrad, the Finns were still looking to regain what they had lost during the Winter War. Just north of Leningrad was the Soviet 23rd Army, stretched across the Karelian Isthmus from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ladoga. The terms of the Winter War had given the Soviets more territory in this area to help safeguard Leningrad, but the Finns wanted their territory back. And back on August 6th, the Karelian Army breached the 23rd's defensive line. Actually, the Soviet defensive line was more like broken into two than breached. And those Soviet troops to the most north were cut off and attacked by other Finnish units. By August 23rd, this was done. As for the remaining Soviet troops in the northern area, they had been taken and evacuated by boat across the lake with much sacrifice of some of their comrades. As for the balance of the 23rd Army, Leningrad still had to be protected, so the men were ordered back closer to Leningrad, where the land they had to shield was more narrow. By September 1st, the Soviet 23rd Army was back to the 1939 Soviet-Finnish border. Oh, there would be a few more Finnish raids and a few more towns taken, ones that had originally been Finnish and were now back with their people. And meanwhile, Stalin and Nastavka did what they do best, created new armies. Yes, the Finns had retaken much of the territory they had recently lost, but now they faced even more Soviet troops before them, should they wish to continue pushing south. But having reached the Mannerheim Line, soon named after Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal Baron Karl Mannheim, they settled down, even though Berlin was screaming for help and taking Leningrad. Screaming may be a bit too hard, but those screams would come in time.